and feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. It's so much nicer to just have to present instead of having to do all the other hosting and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to provide a brief overview of what Pcapp is and does for those of you who don't know. Pcapp started in 1998 as a partnership to represent the collaborative efforts of multiple interests toward native prairie conservation. So our vision is healthy native prairie ecosystems as vital parts of our vibrant and strong communities. So the Pcapp partnership brings together 33 partners consisting of producers, industry, provincial and federal governments, environmental NGOs, and educational institutions working towards a common vision of prairie and species at risk conservation in Saskatchewan. So here we have our 33 partners listed, and we meet twice a year to discuss native prairie issues with the hopes of identifying knowledge gaps, reducing duplication, and working towards a better public understanding and appreciation of native prairie. So Pcapp has a 5-year action plan. And so these are our 3 focus areas in that action plan. There's the native prairie awareness and appreciation, responsible land use on native prairie, and native prairie ecosystem management. So many of our activities may fall within more than one of these focus areas. So here are some examples of our activities that fit under the native prairie awareness and appreciation focus area. So Pcapp has a speaker series or has had for over 10 years. And around 7 years ago, Pcapp started webinars rather than just in-person presentations, and it's been successful since. Native Prairie Appreciation Week occurs in June, and it's to promote native prairie and species at risk to the general public. There's sometimes a tour or webinars, a kids poster contest, a social media photo contest. If we are at farmers markets, we'll hand out native seeds. There's also a declaration by the Ministry of Agriculture and Environment, as well as major cities to increase awareness. We also increase appreciation and awareness through social media. So Caitlin Moreau-Seiler is our stewardship coordinator, and she prepares a social media campaign once a month where information is shared for a week about a species at risk or invasive species, or even just general information like a pollinator week or a migratory bird week. We also have a monthly newsletter that is shared with over 2,000 subscribers about upcoming events and native prairie content. We also offer 2 free education programs, which is Adopt a Rancher for grade 10s, where they learn about the sustainability of a ranch, and then they go on a field trip to actually see a ranch and native prairie. And then Taking Action for Prairies for grades 6 to 8, where students develop an action plan for their school. We also have a booth at Agribition to talk to kids and landowners about native prairie and species at risk. And then under responsible land use on native prairie, we have the speaker series again. Caitlin does a great job of finding excellent speakers that cover topics in all 3 of our focus areas. We also have Prairie's Got the Goods Week, which was last week, and it started in 2017 as a way to share information about ecological goods and services provided by native prairie. Pcapp also publishes articles in Beef Business magazine about species at risk or beneficial management practices or other topics. We also have the Native Prairie Restoration and Reclamation workshop, which is a conference for 200 to 300 people, where there's information about seeding native species, how to restore other aspects of native prairie like the soil and microorganisms, and new techniques and technologies and things like that. So under the native prairie ecosystem management focus area, again, we have the speaker series. We also developed booklets on how to sustainably manage native prairie. Pcapp has been working on developing a guide or multiple guides to managing habitat for species at risk. So we've done 9 species so far, and we're finishing up a multi-species guide that will combine all the habitat attributes of the 9 species to see where their habitat needs overlap and contrast to help management decisions. And then we also plan workshops for land managers with various information that might be of interest to them. Lately, they've been virtual, but we're hoping next year they can be in person again. So that's all I have for today. It was just a brief overview of what our programs and activities are. You can email me at the address here, and I also listed our website if you want to look for anything. Do we have time for questions? Because I see there's one.
Yes, we can take a few minutes. I'm not sure if it's more of a comment or kind of a bigger picture question.
Yeah, it's not like for Pcapp, I guess.
Okay, I will keep note of that, and we will get an answer to Debbie either tonight or at some point tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so thank you so much, Carolyn. I appreciate you taking a couple minutes to do that. Next, Emily, you can come on board and share your screen and take it away.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. All right, here we go. So hi, everyone. My name is Emily Putz. I'm a Habitat Stewardship Coordinator for Nature Saskatchewan's Stewards of Saskatchewan programs. So for those of you that don't know, Nature Saskatchewan, our vision is humanity in harmony with nature. And our mission is to engage and inspire people to appreciate, learn about, and protect Saskatchewan's natural environment. So this is ultimately where the Stewards of Saskatchewan programs stem from. So the Stewards of Saskatchewan programs is a suite of 5 voluntary programs that work directly with landowners to conserve habitat for species at risk in Saskatchewan, as well as to conserve the wider prairie ecosystem. So all 5 programs are kind of modeled after our original program and follow the same basic principles. So we use species at risk as ambassadors for habitat in the province and work with the landowners by signing voluntary stewardship agreements. So these are non-binding handshake agreements that can be canceled at any time. And they're seen as lower risk and very favorable to our landowner participants. So our participants also participate in population monitoring throughout the year with us. So our bird programs, we have an annual census where we ask questions about whether a steward has seen the species on their land and about their general land practices throughout the year. And then as well for our plant program, we have a little bit more of a hands-on, our summer staff take a hands-on approach for population monitoring, and I'll go over that in a few minutes. We also have an outreach and education portion of all of our programs. So we like to get together to host conservation appreciation days, which are taking the form of virtual webinars like this one tonight, as well as we really like in-person visits with our landowners. So we like to get out there as best part of our summer to get out and talking to our landowners. We also have habitat enhancement projects that we do with our landowners, and I'll go over that in a minute as well. So our first of our, I'm just going to give a quick update on all our programs here. So our first program is Operation Burrowing Owl, which is one of the longest running stewardship programs in Canada. And it was initiated in 1987 to address the steep decline of the burrowing owl in the province and targets grassland parcels that are used by burrowing owls. So currently we have 346 participants conserving just over 213,000 acres of land in this program. So quite successful, and we model all our other programs after this one. Our next program is the Shrubs for Shrikes program, which targets land that has loggerhead shrikes on it. So this is a threatened predatory songbird, so they're pretty cool. So this program was initiated in 2003 after a successful pilot in 2002. And we currently have 288 participants conserving 146,000 acres for shrike habitat. Next program is our Plovers on Shore, which concerns shoreline habitat for the endangered piping plover. So this is a listed species, and this program has actually contributed to critical habitat listings for the species, so it's quite successful as well. Currently, we have 57 participants conserving 134 miles of shoreline. So the Rare Plant Rescue Program was initiated in 2002, and while it's modeled after Operation Burrowing Owl, like the others, it does work a little differently. So we don't expect our landowners to go out and look for tiny little plants themselves. So this program, we actually have a summer crew that goes out and searches civil habitat for our target plant species every summer. And we'll also do monitoring. So we try and revisit those plants every 3 to 5 years to see how they're doing. So we currently have 86 participants in this program conserving 251,000 acres of native prairie. And our last program is the Stewards of Saskatchewan banner program for all other species at risk. So currently we have 211 participants conserving 237 acres. And this is kind of our catch-all for any other species at risk. So if you have barn owls or Ferogenous hawks, monarch butterflies, you can join this program. So yeah, so we like to say that our species at risk are ambassadors, so they help conserve habitat for everybody that uses that habitat. We also have habitat enhancement projects that we do with our landowners. So we do native seeding, wildlife-friendly fence, alternative water development, and new this year is Ferogenous hawk nesting platform fencing project. So if you're a landowner out there and you think you might fall into the criteria for one of these projects, you can contact us and let us know, and we can talk to you about that because we're always looking for interested landowners. So many species, in addition to the ones that we talked about here, also benefit from habitat protected through the Stewards of Saskatchewan programs. Upland prairie habitat is home to many game species, including white-tailed deer, mule deer, and upland bird species, including the sharp-tailed grouse, as well as healthy prairie and riparian areas contribute to healthy water bodies and healthy land for our livestock because these are working landscapes. So our stewards are working really hard to keep everything nice and healthy. And we just want to give a big thank you to all our landowners. They're really the heart and soul of these programs, and we couldn't do this work without you guys. So yeah, that was a really, really brief overview of all our Stewards of Saskatchewan programs. And if you'd like to know more about any of them, you can contact us at any time or visit our website at www.naturesask.ca. And I think that's it for me.
Hey, thanks, Emily. Carolyn, we've got a couple minutes here for questions if you wanted to take a look.
Sure. There is a question from Sarah that says, do you need to live on the land to have a volunteer stewardship agreement or just own?
So yeah, I can answer that. So no, you don't need to live out there as long as you own or manage it. You can and have the species at risk. You can join our stewardship programs. So yeah, we have quite a few people that live away from their land, like they might live, you know, close to the city and have land that they rent or have cattle on outside of. So yeah, you can join, definitely.
Awesome, thank you. Stuart asks, will there be more ferruginous hawk surveys?
Oh, I don't know if I can answer that. So each year we do ask our participating landowners with ferruginous hawks to report the ones that they see on their land. So we kind of do surveys that way for our birds that are in our programs, as well as anybody can, if you see one along the highway, you can phone our hoot line and report a sighting to us, and we'll contact the landowner and follow up. So yeah, if you see one, you can report one, and yeah.
Awesome. Laura asks, do these total acreages of land of habitat conserved overlap, or is it each quantity of acres you mentioned separate?
So the separate acres for each of the programs, that's the straight acres for that program. So if we group them all together, some of those acres are multiple programs. So if we group them all together, there'd be overlap. But those were the bulk numbers for each of the 5.
Okay, thank you. And Caitlin asks, what size of land is eligible for stewardship agreements?
Any size of land. We even have people that live on acreages that have barn slows. We have people that shrikes really like just like yard sites. So sometimes people just have some in their shrubs or shelter belts outside their house. We have people living in towns that have signed up for shrikes. So if you have the species, you can have 1 acre and you can join our program. So.
Awesome, thank you. Oh, there's one more. What about something less than an acre? Say half an acre?
Oh, yeah, for sure. If you have monarchs and they, you know, come back to the same patch every year and you want to join our Stewards Saskatchewan banner program and report them, we'd love, you know, to get the updates from you each year. So, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Those are all the questions we have. So thanks, Emily. You're muted, Caitlin.
Oh, I clicked it and it just didn't work. Thank you, Emily. Appreciate that. And we had some really good questions. So thank you, everybody. Next up, I'm going to ask Ian Cook to join us. So Ian Cook, he's a Grasslands Conservation Manager with Birds Canada. He's also a professional agrologist and certified crop advisor. So agriculture has an important role to play in solving the biodiversity and climate crisis. Birds Canada is committed to finding solutions that are mutually beneficial for wildlife, the environment, farmers and ranchers, and society at large. As the Grassland Conservation Manager for Birds Canada, Ian works at the interface of agriculture and conservation to find solutions to conserve grassland ecosystems and integrate birds and biodiversity into the working landscapes. Ian will be speaking about some of the threats facing prairie birds, the work at Birds Canada on the prairies to better understand and conserve our grassland birds, and the role that we all play both as producers or consumers in helping to conserve our prairie birds. So Ian, you're up.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. I'll just get my screen shared here. And I'll just make sure that everybody can see that okay. That looks okay, Caitlin?
Yep, you bet. Looks good.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Great. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you all tonight about grassland conservation, and as Caitlin said, the threats that face prairie birds and some of the things that we all can do to help them. And thank you very much for having me tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity. So a little bit about Birds Canada to start off with. We're a nonprofit charitable organization that we've been around in one form or another since 1960. We started as the Long Point Bird Observatory down on the long point of Lake Erie, and we've grown into a national conservation organization since then. And our mission is to conserve the wild birds of Canada through a number of different ways, including science and partnerships, public engagement, as well as science-based advocacy and on-the-ground actions. And our work has impact on, everything from a local level all the way up to international conservation actions. And our motto is that together we are the voice for Canada's birds, and that really means a lot to us, and we involve a lot of citizen science in a lot of the work that we do. And again, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we all have a role to play in being that voice for Canada's birds and for helping them out. So, many of you will be aware of how special and important the prairies are, but in terms of birds in particular, the Canadian prairies are really important to a large number and diversity of birds. So this map shows the four major migratory routes that birds follow when they're migrating back and forth between their wintering grounds and their summer nesting grounds and breeding grounds. And so each one of these symbols represents a bird that was banded and then recaptured and recorded. So we can see that birds from at least 3 of the major migratory routes in North America use the Canadian prairies either as a place to rest and refuel on their long migrations, or a place to nest and to breed and to raise their young. And the prairie ecosystem, with its grasslands, with the wetlands and the riparian areas, is thought to be important to more bird species than any other ecosystem in North America, because of its importance to so many birds on their migratory routes. Unfortunately, there are a number of birds that aren't doing so well on the Canadian prairies, and those birds that really rely on the Canadian or on that prairie ecosystem, and particularly the grasslands, are seeing fairly dramatic declines in the last 50 years. So many of you might be aware of the report that came out a couple of years ago about 3 billion birds that have been lost since 1970. In that same time frame, we've lost nearly 60% of our grassland birds here in Canada. There are some success stories here and some good news stories. I mean, if we look at waterfowl, particularly geese, they've seen a dramatic increase. There are of course some species within those groups that aren't doing as well, are seeing declines, like northern pintails. But there are stories, some positive actions like from groups like Nature Saskatchewan and from Pcapp and Ducks Unlimited that have, those are important work. But there's still more work to do, and this is a little worrisome when we start to see declines like this for not only the birds, but we also know that birds fill a lot of different roles within the ecosystem and exist at all levels of the food web. So with these declines, it's an indication that maybe our particularly our working landscape ecosystem maybe isn't as healthy as it possibly could be, and that has impacts across the food web up to and including us. So to put some faces to the names of that 60% decline, these are 4 of the really iconic grassland bird specialists that it's these birds that are seeing the heaviest declines, those birds that need fairly large areas of grasslands in order to carry out their life cycle. And 3 out of the 4 of these birds carry the threatened status federally, and then with the Baird sparrow being just one step below it, a species of special concern. And for instance, these longspurs, both the chestnut color longspur and the thick-billed longspur, have seen over 90% declines in their populations since 1970. So what's driving the population losses of these birds? It's really the habitat degradation and loss. That's really the main factor. So we know that we've lost somewhere between 75 to 90% of the native prairie that used to exist on the Canadian prairies. In terms of what that means provincially, Alberta has the most native prairies still remaining at around 40% of its original extent. In Saskatchewan, probably around 15 to 17% still remaining. I'm based in Manitoba here, and unfortunately we have probably less than 1% of the native prairie that used to exist here. So it's those declines that are really driving this, and we're still continuing to see fairly significant losses of our grasslands. So if we look at the northern Great Plains as a whole, including some of those northern states like Montana and North Dakota and South Dakota, we lose kind of on average around an acre of grasslands every minute, about 500,000 acres every year. So if we put that into context a little bit for those birds that were on a previous slide, for instance, a chestnut-colored longspur, they need around 2 acres of grassland they stake out 2 acres out there, and in order to nest and defend and raise their young, they need around 2 acres to be able to do that. So that means if we're losing around an acre every minute, every 2 minutes at least, a chestnut-colored longspur or a thick-billed longspur loses a potential home. So these grassland declines and the habitat loss is really significant for these birds. What's driving the habitat loss? There are a few drivers, or four main drivers of the habitat loss. And resource extraction plays a role. There's an example of a fairly large contiguous grassland that's been had some roads built on it. Lots of these grassland birds need large, contiguous grasslands in order to carry out their life cycle, and when they don't deal well with linear structures, so things like roads, hydro lines, that sort of thing, they have to give that a little bit of a buffer because they don't like being right up close to those linear structures. So when we build a road or something like that through those grasslands, that tends to shrink the actual habitat that's available to them. Invasive species also plays a role, and that's a major concern in lots of areas. So on the top right there, we see a grassland that's been invaded by leafy spurge. And what something like leafy spurge or even crested wheatgrass, when these invasive species come in, they tend to cause uniform habitat structure. And grassland birds like to have a bit of a mosaic or a mix of different vegetation heights. They like a little bit of short grass, they like a little bit of tall grass, and different species need a different mix of that. But with these invasive species, they tend to kind of take over, and it's all about the same height, and it really homogenizes that, and it also homogenizes the invertebrate community and all those sorts of things. And grassland birds just can't really make their home in those sorts of conditions. Shrub encroachment is also a concern with the disruption of the fire cycle for the most part on the prairies. Shrubs can get a foothold and get growing a lot more easily. Luckily, we don't have some of the really invasive woody species that they're dealing with in some of the Western United States at this stage. So it's more just about trying to control those shrubs from getting a foothold, and that can sometimes be a little bit costly, even though they're not necessarily invasive. That means mowing them or reintroducing fire. So something that well-managed our land managers deal with too. But really the biggest driver of grassland loss is this conversion of grasslands to annual cropping. And that's being driven largely by fairly tremendous market pressures. It's often just a lot more profitable to convert these grasslands into annual cropping systems. And there are some things that are built in with our system that also help to incentivize that in some ways actually too. So that's really the biggest driver for sure in my part of the world and in many places in Saskatchewan as well. So what is Birds Canada trying to do about stemming some of this? Well, we work with Nature Saskatchewan and Pcapp in terms of communicating and on things like this, but we also realize and recognize the importance of working with cattle producers and livestock producers in order to keep some of these grasslands intact, because that's, you know, a really good mechanism to keep these grasslands intact, and having cattle producers out there. So something that we've done is we've produced a couple of different publications that focus on connecting producers to the different resources that they might be able to use in order to manage for biodiversity. But this first one is the Grasslands Conservation Incentives Guide that's focused on connecting producers with the programs and incentives that exist out there. We were talking to producers and we heard lots that producers wanted to be able to participate in some of the programs and incentives that could help them provide habitat or other ecological goods and services, but found it difficult and time consuming to track down what all the different programs were that existed out there. So what we did was we took all the different programs and incentives that we could find from across the prairies and put them in the one guide, so that producers and land managers could kind of have a one-stop shop that had enough information in it for them to make a good, or to understand what programs were out there, what some of the eligibility requirements were, all those sorts of things, and what sort of programs might fit with their goals. So I'm actually going through an update right now to this, and I hope to have that out this spring. And so if you know any producers, or if you are a producer that might be looking for some programs or incentives, this might be a really good place to start. The second publication, which is a pretty new publication, it just came out in the fall, is this Climate and Biodiversity Friendly Production Practices Resource Guide, which is a bit of a mouthful, but again, the sort of the same idea here is trying to connect producers and land managers with some of those wonderful resources that exist out there. Carolyn just talked about all the great resources that Pcapp have. So again, just trying to get those into a guide that producers could access fairly easily, and then find out more from that guide. So there's information on how to sequester carbon, improve climate resilience, manage for biodiversity, and then also some restoration resources as well. So I thought I would do just a very quick kind of highlights of some of those resources, and kind of show you what the guide looks like. So for instance, for that carbon sequestration and climate resilience piece, the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association has a really comprehensive guide for different forage best management practices for enhancing soil organic carbon sequestration, as well as the Manitoba government put out a couple of really good guides focused on creating climate friendly but also climate resilient farms. And so there's a lot of really good information in those guides on how to really improve climate resiliency and how to sequester carbon and be more climate friendly. For the managing for biodiversity and species at risk, like Carolyn mentioned, I mean, the Saskatchewan Conservation Action Plan has a really great website that has a lot of great resources on there. So I would have been remiss to not include that in this guide. So I would encourage anyone to check that website out, because a lot of really good information on there. Same with Nature Saskatchewan. They're at home on the range, living with Saskatchewan species at risk guide is really, really good. It has a lot of great information on the different species at risk, but also some of the myths about species at risk and those sorts of things. And then there are some other resources there too, including some of those optimal attributes for species at risk that Carolyn was talking about as well. And then there's also a page here, a whole section on some native forage establishment and also the seed sources. So again, Pcapp has some good information on that, but there's a number of guidebooks and there's the Saskatchewan Forage Council's Forage UPIC tool. If you're a producer, I mean, that's a really slick tool to be able to use to find out what sort of native forage might fit your situation the best. Even if you're somebody looking to establish a pollinator habitat on your acreage or in your garden in the city, there's probably some information in here that would be good for you. There's a resource, or there's a guide there from the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund that has a lot of really good information on how to establish a pollinator habitat. And then there's also a list from the Saskatchewan Native Plant Society that has all the different suppliers and producers of native seed and native plants from across the prairies, which is a really handy tool. So that's kind of a really quick highlight reel of that guide. And if you want to access those, they're at birdscanada.org/grasslands, and I'll have a link at the end. Some of our other work is focusing around grassland bird surveys. So in 2021, we were able to start up a grassland bird monitoring program through support from Environment Climate Change Canada and then also the Conservation Trust here in Manitoba. And that involved over 1,200 total survey stations in Manitoba and Saskatchewan that represented over 50,000 hectares of grassland habitat in those provinces. And this included both in-person and automated recording unit surveys. So in the picture there, that's an automated recording unit that was deployed in a grassland with a cattle shield on it to try to keep the cows from eating the microphones, which worked to various degrees of success. But really this program and this project is focused on enhancing our understanding of the impacts of our management and also our conservation actions, and trying to communicate the value of these grasslands and of these pastures to biodiversity, and looking at ways that we can maybe start to leverage that biodiversity value into driving revenues and lowering risk for producers that are providing that biodiversity. We talked about what we can do and what Birds Canada does and a lot from the producer perspective, but there are also a lot of ways that consumers, especially, so we all could be involved with bird conservation and grassland conservation. And the first, so they're I split it up into kind of three larger topics of ways that we can help. And the first is buying bird friendly. And our purchasing decisions as consumers can really have a positive effect on birds and we can support production systems that are providing habitat for birds. And one of the first ways to do that is buying Canadian beef. So we know that prairie producers, we know that cattle producers play a really key role in keeping grassland habitat intact. We talked about that a little bit before. So 90% of the remaining grasslands in Canada are privately owned, and most of these are by cattle producers. So land use for cattle in Canada is about a third of the agricultural production land, but it really punches above its weight when it comes to providing habitat for wildlife. It provides 2/3 of the wildlife habitat on agricultural land. So it really is providing a lot of habitat, particularly for grassland birds. And we also know that the prairie plants evolved with grazing pressure, and the wildlife also evolved with that grazing. So in the absence of free roaming bison, cattle can play a role in providing that structure that the grassland birds need in some of the plant and producing some of that plant biodiversity. We know that grazing helps diversify the different plant species that are on the prairie. So it really needs that grazing and that responsible grazing to provide the habitats that the grassland birds need. We know too that grasslands are huge carbon sinks, and that when we till them, we release a lot of the carbon that's been sequestered for millennia in the root systems and in the soil of those grasslands. Grasslands hold about 180 tons per hectare of carbon. So that when we till them, we lose 30 to 55% of that carbon that was previously sequestered. So I'm certainly not telling anyone how to eat or anything, but if you do choose to eat beef, please, I would encourage you to consider choosing Canadian beef, making sure that when you're at the grocery store, the beef that you're buying is raised in Canada, because it will have spent some portion of its life out on pasture. If you want to take it a step further, you can look for grass-fed or grass-finished beef, because it will have spent more of its lifetime on grass and means that there's more grassland habitat. And then there's also the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which Birds Canada sits on the steering committee for that, and is really trying to elevate the biodiversity component of that system. And you can find the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, I believe, in Loblaws and as well in Walmart. So if you shop at either of those places, you can keep an eye out for it there. Other ways that we can improve the way that we buy bird friendly is seeking out production systems that try to reduce its pesticide use. So is new, and is maybe, yeah, it's fairly new, but we do know that in general, regenerative systems tend to significantly reduce the amount of pesticides that are being used within that production system. And these reduction of pesticides, particularly the reduction in insecticides, can really have a positive impact, particularly on aerial insectivores. So if we remember that graph, the grassland birds were one of those guilds that saw a significant decline, but also were the aerial insectivores. And part of that is attributed to some of the contamination of some of our wetlands on the Canadian prairies of some insecticides. So, there are ways that you can connect with some of these producers that are producing regenerative agriculture, and probably one of the easiest ways is just to look for local producers in your area by quickly Googling. There are a couple of platforms like True Local that can deliver grass-fed beef and pasture-raised meats to your door. And there's also a website called Meatocracy that helps connect it. But really, probably one of the easiest ways is just Googling grass-fed beef producers or regenerative ag producers in your area and getting connected with those producers. So, and then even your cup of joe in the morning, your cup of coffee in the morning can really help migratory birds. And while they may not help some of these grassland specialists that we're talking about, buying bird-friendly coffee can help birds like clay-colored sparrows and Baltimore orioles and those sorts of birds that might live in those aspen parklands or in your gardens. And what bird-friendly coffee is that it's coffee that's been produced sort of even above and beyond shade-grown coffee, where it keeps that habitat intact and on the wintering grounds for a lot of our birds, and growing coffee in such a way that it's harmonious with those bird species. So we have a bit of a partnership actually with with a company called Birds and Beans Coffee, based out of Southern Ontario, that sell the Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee. And I believe if you use the promo code Warblers, you get the 10% of the cost of this to our podcast, which I'll get into in a little bit. But so this is all just to say that the food purchases that we make can have a really big impact on the world around us. And every time you spend $1, you're kind of voting for the future that we want. So our purchasing power can have a lot of impact on governments and corporations to shift those supply chains to the types of future that we want. And that's really important here on the Canadian prairies. So we talked about buying bird friendly. What are some other ways that we can support bird conservation? Well, the second way is gardening for birds. And Birds Canada actually just started up a really great tool called birdgardens.ca. And what this does is that, excuse me, it really gives you a platform to be able to filter down and find some of those native plants that would be good for your area, but also really good for the wildlife, particularly birds and pollinators, and welcome those species into your garden. So this is a really neat tool. I've actually used it recently. I want to put a vine out on my deck and on a trellis. So I took a couple screenshots of that process. So you go on to on birdgardens.ca and you can find your bird zone. And then it gives you this plant locator tool. And so I went through, well, I wanted a vine, so I could select that. I'm in bird garden zones, kind of on the edge of 10 and 12. So I clicked both those, and all those different things that you need for gardening, like your soil and your sun. And I wanted to make, have as large a benefit for wildlife as I could. So I ticked all those. And then it gave me these 3 different species that I could look at in terms of what vine I might want. So I looked at American bittersweet, and it's got these great little all these great little berries for birds in the fall time and all those sorts of things. So if you're a gardener or you're looking into incorporating native species into your garden, this is a really, really neat tool that to try to incorporate some of that and garden for birds. So. And then the last way that I wanted to talk about today was getting involved. And again, like I said off the top, Birds Canada really incorporates a lot of citizen science in our work. And there's a number of citizen science programs across the country, including in Saskatchewan, and that many of you might be already a part of. But there's opportunities for everyone, regardless of skill level. If you're just getting started and you want to mark down some of the birds that you see at your feeder in your backyard, there's Project Feeder Watch. That's a really great one, or a great backyard bird count. Or if you want to go out and listen to owls and the Nocturnal Owl Survey, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of really neat programs that are a lot of fun and really interesting, but they're also really important to to inform us as conservationists and my colleagues that are scientists, that really that data and that open source data really is important for our work. So it's I would encourage everyone to get involved. If you want to learn more about the relationship between livestock producers and grassland birds, more about our purchasing decisions, or if you're concerned about climate change and beef's role in that and wondering how to reconcile that with grassland birds and that sort of thing, we do have a number of blogs up on our website that would go into more in depth on that too. And if you haven't joined our e-news yet either, I would really encourage you to join that as well and keep up to date with all the things that we're doing here at Birds Canada. And actually in the next e-news, there's going to be an article about a really interesting bird that we found through our bird surveys this summer in Manitoba that was a fair bit out of its range. So I'll give you that little teaser, and if you're interested, I would encourage you to sign up for the e-news for Birds Canada and find out more about that. And then, as I mentioned, Birds Canada also produces a podcast. If you're somebody that listens to podcasts, this is a really, I learn something every time I listen to it from my colleagues. They have really great guests on, covering just the whole gamut of bird conservation in Canada. And it's just a really, really well put together podcast that I learn a lot every time I listen, and I look forward to it coming out all the time. So that's pretty well it for me. Like I say, if you want to learn more about our work or read those blogs or download those the incentives guide or the resources guides /grasslands, And for more information on the citizen science opportunities, visit birdscanada.org/you-can-help/citizen science. And then for more on gardening for birds, visit birdgardens.ca. And if anybody has any questions about that we don't have time to maybe answer tonight, or you want more information on the guides or anything like that, I'm happy to talk grassland conservation and grassland birds anytime. So you can email me at icook@birdscanada.org or call me anytime. So, and I think that just about does it for me, Caitlin. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian. That's always so interesting. I know when we chatted earlier, we were talking about the bird-friendly coffee, and that was brand new information to me. I didn't know that was a thing. So that's all really good things that that we can all do. And I really loved your mix of information for producers, as well as you know, just average people that just want to be able to help out. So really, really great information. So thank you so much. Yeah, we do have a couple minutes here for questions. So Carolyn, if you want to take care of that.
Sure. Kay has a question. Are there any similar resources for biodiversity conservation in areas further north? So in the boreal transition ecoregion?
Not that I can necessarily think of off the top of my head that might be similar. However, you know, some of those resources that would be in the resource guide, certainly, you know, they're not all specific necessarily to that, you know, core grassland area. There's going to be some resources in there that will certainly be applicable to sort of that Aspen Parkland boreal transition zone for sure. And then the incentives guide is not necessarily restricted to just the southern grasslands either. There are programs in there that would go further north, and particularly watersheds in Manitoba here, or the water stewardship areas in Saskatchewan, or the conservation areas. Yeah, so I would say that there's information in both of those guides that might be applicable to you, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head that's specific for that region at the moment, but somebody else on the panel might know better than me.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Laura. She asked if the podcast is on Spotify.
Yes, I think so. I think pretty well everywhere where you can get your,
Yep.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
I just
yeah,
looked it up, so yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think anywhere where you get your podcast, either from iTunes or Spotify or Stitcher or those sorts of things, I think it's available on all of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just looking, and they have a pretty neat like lineup of podcasts already like on there.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. They had one on seabirds that kind of blows my mind. Like seabirds are pretty, you know, grassland birds are my kind of my first love, but seabirds, man, they're pretty cool. So I would encourage everybody to check it out. Like I say, I learn something new every time I listen. So
awesome. Marissa has a question. I live in a new neighborhood with hardly any trees. Is there anything I can do to encourage birds to come to my yard with gardening or bird feeders, or will they likely not be interested in stopping by my neighborhood at all?
No, definitely. You know, like I say, getting started with incorporating native plants within your garden and having some of those perennials that would provide food and cover for some of those birds. So either incorporating some shrubs so that there's some more cover, or even just, you know, flowers and grasses within a native garden. Those would all attract birds, and particularly if you're feeding birds, that will likely attract them as well. You're going to get a different mix of birds likely than in maybe an older neighborhood that has mature trees, but you'll get some birds, I'm sure, nonetheless. And you know, incorporating those native species within a garden is one of the better things you can do for both birds and for insects. And when you have insects, you'll have birds as well, probably too. So
Yeah, for sure. I'm really looking forward to that Birds Gardens website and plant some native species this year. So it's gonna be
perfect.
awesome. I think that's all the questions that are up right now. I just had a quick question about like tracking. Do you have any idea how many people use the resource guide or the incentive guide? Like, is there a way to track?
Yeah, I ask, essentially the way that I track it is that I ask the guy, like my colleague that looks after our website, to run a bit of a report every now and again just to see the page views essentially. And I haven't done that for a while actually, Caroline, which I should do again. And I wouldn't want to venture a guess, to be honest. I can't remember off the top of my head how many people have accessed that. It kind of goes through spikes, but particularly when I do things like this, it tends to spike it up. But yeah, I think last I checked, there were 1,500 downloads or something like that for the incentives guide. So, but that was quite some time ago. I want to say that was probably, yeah, almost 6 or 7 months ago. So.
Okay, cool. I also just realized that we don't have like the resource guide on our website, so I'll be putting it up soon.
Okay, perfect. It is fairly new, so
yeah,
I mean, it just came out in the fall, and yeah, so
yeah. Yeah, so that's everything. So back to you, Caitlin.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Ian. Okay, so last but not least, Laurie Johnson, she's up next, and Laurie has been the owl coordinator at the Saskatchewan Burrowing Owl Interpretive Center for 12 years. She grew up on a farm just 20 minutes outside of Moose Jaw, and this is where her love for all creatures was developed. So Laurie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caitlin. And I want to thank you for inviting us to join everybody again tonight on this Zoom presentation. We're certainly missing seeing everybody in person, but we're so glad that we can still do meetups like this and help share our love for burrowing owls and the native prairie that they call home. I do have a little special guest that I'm going to bring out in just a few moments. But before I get him out, my hands are full. I like to start with just a little bit of background information about the Saskatchewan Burrowing Owl Interpretive Center. We're actually located in Moose Jaw, and we first opened our doors in the summer of 1997. And we came about as a partnership between the Moose Jaw Exhibition Company, whose grounds we're located on, and a couple of other nature organizations around the province, primarily Nature Saskatchewan and their Operation Burrowing Owl program. And the reason why that partnership was developed was because burrowing owls were listed as an endangered species here in Canada in 1995. And historically, Moose Jaw had a few areas located around the city limits where we actually had a small population of burrowing owls that returned to these various locations around the city for nesting purposes. And as the numbers began to decrease, with them being listed as an endangered species, we saw the need to, start educating the public about some of our very own endangered species that make their homes in our backyards or, in other areas of the province. So with our group of burrowing owls, which were located here on the exhibition grounds, we were able to, allow people to see them in a natural type of habitat and get to learn a little bit about them. Unfortunately, though, the numbers have fallen so greatly here that we haven't had a wild burrowing owl sighting within the city limits since 2005. So although, it is getting harder and harder for people to find these birds in the wild, we still have a small captive group of burrowing owls that stay with us year round at the center. And we are able to build kind of a program around these little guys that still allow the public to come and see out the burrowing owls and get to learn a little bit more about them. And we're actually very lucky to have 3 hand-raised burrowing owls that we use in our educational programming. And one of those little guys is joining us here tonight. And his name is Peanut. And he was actually hatched right here at the center. Both of his parents were captive burrowing owls that lived here at the center. And he is 8 years old now, or he's going to be 8 years old this coming spring. And he has been one of our ambassador owls since he was just a couple of days old. And the reason why we have these little ambassador owls is because it gives the public an opportunity to get up close and personal with an endangered species that they might not otherwise get the opportunity to get to know. And these little guys are really interesting birds, and we're so lucky that we have the opportunity to share them with the public, through platforms like this, but also through having visitors come right to the center and visit them here in Moose Jaw. And we also do a lot of traveling with our Owls on Tour program, giving students and other people the opportunity who can't get into Moose Jaw to actually still meet these little guys. And the reason we want to spread the word about the burrowing owls is, again, because they are an endangered species here in Canada. And we want to be able to promote the conservation of not only the burrowing owls, but their prairie habitat. And our main focus, our way of doing that, is through our educational programming. And there are a lot of things that we share with, through our educational programming. And I like just to share a few of those things with everybody tonight, because these guys really are quite a unique species, and we are very lucky to have, a small population that still calls the areas around Moose Jaw and Regina home. And we'd like to continue to see that for generations to come. Now, these guys are a grasslands or prairie type bird, and they have evolved over a course of millions of years to be specially adapted to living on the prairies. They're actually the only raptor species in the world that will nest underground. And that's actually how they came by their name, burrowing owls. An interesting fact, though these guys do like to utilize burrows, they don't normally dig their own burrows. Instead, they'll move into abandoned burrows that have been left behind by prairie dogs, badgers, gophers. Sometimes they'll even use man-made structures. Peanut just decided to give himself a little time out, so I'll leave him in his kennel for a few minutes and then I'll bring him back out. So typically you find these guys living in the southern portions of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, and a small interior portion of BC, in and around the Okanagan Valley, where you find the grasslands. And they're considered to be a western burrowing owl. Now, there are several different subspecies of burrowing owls that you'll find around the world, but it is only the Canadian or the western burrowing owls that are classified as endangered. Now, some of the other subspecies that live down in the States and down into Central and South America, their status differs according to the location of their population. Throughout the States, they are a species of special concern or threatened, and down in Central and South America, some of their populations have actually been increasing due to some of the deforestation that's been occurring there. So the Western burrowing owls are classified as endangered, and biologists estimate that there's anywhere between 500 and 800 pairs remaining in Canada. And in order for us to downgrade them off the list, we need to see over 3,000 individual pairs. So there's still a lot of work for us to do. And, a lot of that comes through doing our education and conserving our grasslands. So some of the other little interesting things about these little guys is that they are one of the few owl species that are classified as diurnal. So unlike most of the other owl species that are nocturnal and active throughout the night, burrowing owls are active throughout the daylight hours. And so they're one of those few species that we're actually lucky enough to be able to go out and do some studies with during the daylight hours, which makes it a little bit easier. These guys also have a rather specialized diet in that they are primarily insect and small rodent based. So some of the problems that have been affecting other grassland birds will also affect the burrowing owls. So as Ian was talking, habitat loss, fragmentation, the use of pesticides, all of those things have affected our burrowing owl population as well. The Canadian population is also migratory. So our burrowing owls are only here for a breeding season. So typically they will begin returning to the southern parts of the Prairie provinces in late April, early May. They'll stop, raise a family, and then come late fall, late September, early October, they will travel down to their wintering grounds in Texas and Mexico. So being a migratory species also means that we tend to see a higher mortality rate in them as well. One of the problems that's specific with the burrowing owls is the fact that a lot of the burrowing owls that are hatched in a given year have a very high mortality rate. And the owls that do survive, their dispersal rate and returns to the Prairie provinces are very low. So there's a whole combination of factors that affect our population and our numbers. And we still haven't really recovered from the drastic loss of burrowing owl populations that we saw in the early and mid 80s and 90s. So, there still is a lot of work that needs to be done to help ensure that, future generations can enjoy these burrowing owls. And a lot of the things that, everybody was talking about tonight are not only important for the burrowing owls, but for a lot of our other endangered species. And unfortunately, sometimes it's easy for us to kind of get sidelined and forget that, we have a lot of endangered species just in our own backyards and in Canada that require just as much help and protection as some of the larger, more flashy animals that we hear about, like the gorillas, the elephants, the orangutans. So we can all do our part in helping ensure that, our native species and our native grasslands survive. And I'm so glad that we were able to join, tonight and the other panelists and share some of our love with you guys about our native animals and our native prairie habitat. So I think that's kind of the gist of my presentation. So if we wanted to do any questions, I'm quite happy to answer those.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Laurie. And Peanut, do you mind holding him up just a little bit more into the camera? Oh, is he sitting down?
He is. Peanut was actually on medical leave for a while. He managed to dislocate a talon. So sometimes I think it still bothers him a little bit. So yes, he's decided to sit right down on the job.
Well, he looks really comfy. So does Peanut have black eyes, Laurie?
He does. His pupils are a little dilated. It does have to do with some of the low light levels in here, but his age is beginning to show. And we've seen that in some of our older owls. Their pupils tend to stay dilated.
Interesting. Yeah, because I know I've seen some photos And I think there may be a different subspecies that have black eyes. They don't have the yellow eyes like our burrowing owls do. So
Yeah, yes, you see some of those down in Florida, I believe. They've got a population with that genetic predisposition. Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell, but he does have a little bit of yellow still showing.
Yeah, well, we appreciate Peanut joining us, even though he's, you know, tired from his healing journey. So so we've got a few, well, just one question that's come in and a comment. So I'll let Carolyn handle that. And please, anyone, if you have any questions, just type them in.
Thanks, Caitlin. So Sandra is asking, when is the Interpretive Center open?
We open on the May long weekend. So this year it's Saturday, May 21st, the center will be open. And we remain open to the public until the holiday Monday in September.
And do you know if people will have to make an appointment, or can they just show up?
Yeah, we haven't quite ironed out all the details yet. It'll depend on kind of whether or not we're able to hire the number of summer students that we want to. So my best advice for people would be to kind of check our website periodically to see about the updates, or to give us a call at the office.
Great, thank you. Stuart asks, he also has a comment saying that I remember seeing them on the golf courses in Moose Jaw. But he also asks, what is the lifespan of the owls?
In the wild, they do have one of the shorter lifespan. It's typically anywhere between 3 and 6 years. And in captivity, of course, we can expand on that lifespan, and typically we'll see anywhere between 8 and 10 years. I believe the oldest burrowing owl in captivity lived for 15 years.
Wow. And how old is the oldest owl at the center?
Our oldest owl made it to 11 and a half.
Awesome. Rebecca has a comment. She says, we love you, Peanut, and thank you for all your years of service. Can't believe you are 8 years old already.
Yeah, time certainly flies with these little guys.
Caitlin has a question. Are burrowing owls good pest control in a pasture?
They are. A burrowing owl can actually eat their weight daily in insects. And typically out on the pastures, it tends to be those kind of grass eating insects like grasshoppers, crickets, or beetles. So they can eat their weight daily, and they've been known to capture and eat anywhere between 120 and 130 small rodents in a 7-day period. So if you get a family of burrowing owls, which can range anywhere between, from 5 to 12 in a nest, you've got some pretty good natural pest control right there.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you for that answer. That's all the questions we have. Oh, there's one more. What are the major factors for their population decline?
Probably the biggest would be habitat loss or fragmentation. And then along with that, you get some compounding factors that would normally maybe not affect them quite as much if they still had that natural type of range that they historically had. So along with the habitat loss or destruction, you see a decrease in prey items. And a lot of that tends to be due to pesticide and rodenticide use. Because of course, the areas that have been natural habitats that has been augmented has usually been augmented over to agricultural uses. And having, pests on your land is not beneficial. So we tend to like to get rid of them. And that can affect, the ability for them to find enough food as well as, perhaps them ingesting that poisons directly, which of course, poisons are indiscriminate killers. And then along with, the use of pesticide and rodenticide use, you usually see less biodiversity in an area. And it's particularly difficult for the burrowing owls if there is a loss of other burrowing mammals in that area, because again, they don't dig their own burrows. So they're relying on burrows that have been left behind by gophers and badgers and prairie dogs. And if there aren't burrows available, they're not going to stop in those areas to breed, and we're not seeing our population increase.
Right. And so how many young do they usually have? It
can vary depending on the female's age, but typically it's anywhere between 5 and 12 eggs, and they only will typically lay a single clutch per breeding season. And an average nest size tends to be 8 or 9.
Awesome, thank you. And Rebecca asks, do you still have your adoption program? And if so,
yes,
how
we
does
do
that
still
work?
have our adoption program. It is one of the main ways that the center raises money to help us continue with our educational programming, as well as continuing to give our burrowing owls the best care possible. And it's a symbolic adoption, of course, and you can do it for a variety of different time lengths for a variety of different price differences. And you get the information about the burrowing owls, as well as some personal pictures of the burrowing owl and some information, and all the proceeds again go directly back to the center. So if anybody's interested, they can always contact us at the office, or they can go through our website and do it right online there.
And so if someone were to come to visit the center and falls in love with one of the owls, can they adopt it on the spot?
Yes, they can.
Perfect. I think I'll make a trip to Moose Jaw this summer. So there aren't any other questions. So Caitlin, did you want to?
For sure. Yes, thank you so much, Carolyn, for that. All right, so thank you so much, Laurie and Peanut, for being here with us tonight. We really appreciate you coming, and I'm so glad that Peanut was able to make it.
Yes, we were a little worried that he wasn't going to be ready, but I'm glad he could join us as well. And again, thank you so much for having us come out.
Thanks, Laurie. And I hope that we can have some in-person events again soon, because as nice as it is to see him on a screen, it's even better in person. So
yes, it'll be nice when we can do that again.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Okay, well, this brings us to the end of our webinar tonight. So on behalf of Nature Saskatchewan and the Prairie Conservation Action Plan, I'd like to sincerely thank Carolyn, Emily, Ian, Laurie, and of course, Peanut for being here with us tonight. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. So once the webinar ends, a very quick survey should just open up in your browser, and we would really sincerely appreciate if you'd fill it out for us. These surveys help us improve our events in the future, and we do take the time to read through each of them. Again, make sure to check out Nature Saskatchewan and Prairie Conservation Action Plan's YouTube channel in the near future for a recording of this webinar, as well as all of our past webinar recordings as well. And again, reminder to watch your inbox and your spam folder to see if you've won a door prize tonight. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed yourselves and learned something new. And thank you and have a good night.